Shabbat Shalom. So this morning, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion. We didn't have our Parsha class today. So, we're going to do something a little bit in between. So, if you've been taking a little break during Torah reading, time to wake up. We're going to hear each other. And we got a mic. So, I got some questions for us this morning, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. So if you have an idea this morning or an answer, raise your hand. We got a mic so that we could hear each other. I want us to look this morning, and if you'd like to follow along kind of where we're going to be looking, we're in our Eitz Chaim, in our Torah. And in our Parsha, we're in this moment where Joseph has revealed himself to his brothers. After being estranged for years, after being apart, Joseph has been in Egypt. He becomes second in command to Pharaoh. And his brothers had actually been the ones to send him to Egypt. As a young man, Joseph's brothers had thrown him into a pit and they sold him as a slave. So they haven't seen each other. And they're standing before one another. And Joseph, after seeing that his brothers have done tshuva, that his brothers have repented, he reveals himself and says, I am Joseph. Big surprise. I mean, if we're thinking about what are some of the most dramatic moments in the Torah, I would say this is one of them. I mean, the brothers have no idea who he is. And Joseph, one of the highest commanding people in Egypt, reveals, oh, I'm your brother. And when he does this, it's an incredibly emotional moment. There's tears. The brothers are speechless. They can't believe it. And in this moment, I'm looking at verse 14, chapter 45, verse 14, on the bottom of page 277. We're in this moment of overflowing emotions. We see that Joseph embraced his brother Benjamin around the neck and wept. And Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers. And this moment of they haven't seen each other for years. They come back together. There's a kiss, and they fall on each other's necks. And when I read this, it seemed a little familiar to a story we've read in the past. So I want us to think for 10 seconds. Anybody got an idea of another story where brothers who had a pretty tension-filled relationship don't see each other for a long time, and in the moment where they come back together, they fall on their necks and they kiss? Think for 10 seconds. And when you've got one, raise your hand. All right? Okay, I see some hands, but we'll take another 5 seconds. Some people need a moment. All right, so hands up. Who's got one?
Should we start here?
Right, we've got a mic back. Okay.
Yeah, it happened to me. And it was the most exciting moment.
Okay, so this has happened to somebody in the room. The most exciting moment, an emotional-filled moment. Okay, so I wasn't thinking about that one. I was thinking about another one in the Torah, but that's fantastic. So All right, so also, I guess, raise your hand if that's happened to you before, but we'll actually get there. We're going to get there a little bit later. So what's another one that happened in our Torah?
Jacob and Esau.
Jacob and Esau, great. There we go, Jacob and Esau. Another story, Joseph's father. Another story, Jacob and Esau, who had a pretty tension-filled relationship. And they don't see each other for years and years. And when they come back together, and if you're following along, we could go back to chapter 33 on page 203 in our Eitz Chaim, chapter 33. And we're looking at verse 4. And here again, we see some similar language. Esau ran to greet him. Esau goes to greet his brother Jacob after not seeing him for a long time, and they're not sure, how is this reconnection going to play out? He embraced him, falling on his neck. He kissed him, and they wept. So what similarities do we have between the two stories with the language? Let's see some hands. What did we see in this moment that they come back together? What's similar? I hear mumblings, but you know, let's hear each other. So raise your hand if you got one. What happens? Yeah. Oh, gonna wait for, you know, we want to hear each other. So I'm mic'd up, but. All right, so Boris, so what do we have that's similar in these two scenes?
They did a similar thing. They fell on each other's, on their necks, they cried, and they kissed.
Great.
Or they kissed and cried.
So the Torah, when it's playing out these scenes, has them falling on their necks, they cry, and they kiss. Great. So we got some parallel things happening. Yeah, do we have another hand? Okay.
When they say falling on their neck.
Great. What's that mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean that they fell on their necks? So in the two stories, the rabbis are thinking, what does it mean that they fell on their necks? And how do we interpret that? And if we're just reading this story, these two stories, it might seem like, oh, this is a really beautiful moment. You got two sets of brothers who haven't seen each other. They're not sure how it's going to end up. They hug, they embrace, they kiss, and they fall on their necks. And instead of the rabbis reading these stories as being just filled with beauty and love, the falling on the neck is a little weird. So in the text of Jacob and Esau, anybody got an idea of what do the rabbis say about the falling on the neck? What, okay, so maybe a little klutzy. Are they, you know, are they unstable? Is this a moment where they're actually not standing strong, they're falling and it's unstable? Great. Any other ideas? What do the rabbis maybe think about, especially with Jacob and Esau? Is it a nice falling on the neck, or is it something not nice? Okay, if you got a thought, let's raise a hand so we could hear each other. Yeah, we got a thought in the back here. Forgiveness of each other showing weakness. Right, is there something about vulnerability? Yeah, Marla's got a hand in the back.
Thank you. Well, so I go with that read, the positive read, but isn't there also a midrash that says one brother, I think Esau, bit the other brother?
Great. That the midrash, some of the rabbis say, wait a second, this wasn't just a nice hug and a kiss, but rather Esau went to bite his brother Jacob, and Jacob turns his neck to stone to protect himself. Now, it's a little fantastical, but the rabbis are pointing to something where in these moments of reconciliation, we're not always sure about intentions. We're not sure. That brothers haven't seen each other. Last time they saw each other, Esau perhaps was running after Jacob to kill him. So Jacob's not sure, and maybe he thought for a moment, wait a second, this is not an embrace. I'm going to be attacked, so I need to protect myself. And actually, in the story of Joseph and his brothers, the rabbis also don't read the falling on the two necks as only positive. The rabbis also read that story to say, oh, falling down on the necks, that's about the two temples that are destroyed. Sure, I know, we got some questioning looks, but ultimately, why are the rabbis reading these two stories as not just stories of love and embrace? Why are the rabbis looking at these two stories of brothers who haven't seen each other in years, who had challenging relationships, and in the moment where they rejoin, there's some questions? That even though the text says there's an embrace and there's a kiss and the necks, the rabbis are a little bit unsure. So we could ask ourselves, why is that? Or what do we do with that challenge of these mixed emotions that might happen in these situations? And it made me think of one of our blessings that we say when you haven't seen someone in a long time. That our Jewish tradition actually has a specific blessing that we say, if you haven't seen someone in a long time, let's say you haven't seen someone in a year, that there's a blessing you're supposed to say when you see that person. Now, if you're just thinking, okay, what might that blessing be? If you were to come up with it on your own, think for 5 seconds, what kind of blessing might that be? Let's get some ideas. Okay, shehechianu, right? You might think that after not seeing someone for a long time, finally seeing them again, and I'll say, we've all experienced that in COVID, of not seeing people in person in a long time. You might think that when you see them again, you should say, shehechianu, which is the blessing we say, thank you, God, for bringing us to this moment, this time that we existed for this to happen. That's also what I would think. But that's not the blessing that our Jewish tradition attributes to these moments. Rather, we're actually meant to say the blessing of Mechayeh HaMeitim. And that means of reawakening the dead. That when you haven't seen someone in a long time, it's almost as if something has been brought back to life. And we actually say this line, Mechayeh HaMeitim, multiple times a day in our Amidah prayer. We said it this morning, and we're going to say it again, that we thank God all the time for the ability to reawaken the dead. But it's a strange thing to say if you haven't seen someone in a long time. Now you might think, wait a second, Rabbi, maybe this blessing is attributed to this moment because in the rabbinic period, if you haven't seen someone in a long time, there's no FaceTime, there's no text message, there's not even email. So, I mean, if you haven't heard from someone in a long time and then you bump into them, it really might feel like, oh, it's almost like they've reawakened from the dead. But I think that there's also something more here. That it's commenting on what's that emotional experience of reconnecting with someone you haven't seen in a long time. That just like Jacob and Esau and Joseph and his brothers, they're not just seeing each other again. but they're actually reinventing or reawakening a relationship. That the relationship has become dormant. The relationship almost doesn't exist, and they have to bring it back to life. They have to say, this isn't something that's easy. Because if it were easy, we wouldn't be saying coming back from the dead. I mean, that's no easy thing. That's something only God can do. But in these moments of seeing someone after a long time, there's actually work that has to be done to reawaken the relationship. We could just go about saying, you know, courteous hellos and say, oh, so nice to see you, you know, a little hug and a kiss, and be on our way. And that's one kind of relationship, but that's not a relationship that's alive. That's just keeping the status quo. But actually, if we're gonna see someone, if we're gonna see a brother who we haven't seen in years, and we're not sure where the relationship's gonna go, we have to say, we're reawakening, we're bringing back to life something here. So my blessing for us in this new secular year that we're entering is that just like Joseph and his brothers, and Jacob and Esau, we sometimes have to do work to reawaken relationships. And if we're faced with the opportunity to see someone we haven't seen in a long time in this coming year, that we're able to say, Mechaye Hametim, thank you, God, for bringing this back to life, and I too am going to do the work to bring it back to life. Shabbat Shalom.